During the division of assets, my daughter-in-law kicked me out of the meeting room. This moment is for heirs only. When my lawyer walked in, everyone fell off their chairs. $8 million, all in my pockets. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My hands were still shaking as I walked into the law office that Tuesday morning. 3 weeks had passed since Blaine's funeral, and I still couldn't believe he was gone. 45 years of marriage, and now I was sitting in a sterile conference room waiting to discuss the division of his estate like he was just another item on someone's to-do list. The mahogany table stretched before me, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. I clutched my purse tighter, feeling every one of my 68 years weighing on my shoulders. Byron arrived first, my only son looking uncomfortable in his pressed suit. He gave me a weak smile, but didn't sit beside me. Instead, he chose a chair across the table. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. Before I could respond, Ainsley swept into the room like she owned the place. My daughter-in-law had always carried herself with an arrogance that made my skin crawl, but today it was worse. She wore a black designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her sharp features look even more predatory. "Byron, darling," she cooed, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. She glanced at me briefly, her blue eyes cold as winter ice. "Maureen." The way she said my name made it sound like a disease. I forced a smile and nodded, determined not to let her see how much her presence unsettled me. Blaine had always handled Ainsley, somehow managing to keep the peace between us. Without him as a buffer, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Mr. Henderson, Blaine's longtime attorney, entered with his briefcase and a stack of papers. He was a kind man in his 70s who had helped Blaine with business matters for over 2 decades. His face was somber as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," he began, adjusting his glasses. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to address Blaine's final wishes regarding his estate." Ainsley leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Of course. We're ready to hear everything." Something in her tone made my stomach twist. The way she said "we," as if I wasn't even in the room. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, suddenly feeling like an intruder in my own life. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading from the will. As he went through the legal language, I found myself studying my son's face. Byron had Blaine's strong jaw and dark eyes, but where his father had been warm and decisive, Byron seemed weak and easily influenced. When had he changed? When had he stopped being the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him? "The primary residence on Maple Drive," Mr. Henderson continued, "along with the vacation property in Colorado, will be—" "Excuse me," Ainsley interrupted, her voice sharp as a knife. She turned to look directly at me, her expression hardening. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Ainsley stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound sent chills down my spine. "This meeting is for heirs only, family members who actually have a legal right to Blaine's estate." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the color drain from my face as the implication sank in. "I'm his wife," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Were," Ainsley corrected, her smile cruel and satisfied. "You were his wife, but now you're just someone who happened to live in his house. This discussion is about real inheritance, about people who matter in the family business." I looked desperately at Byron, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his wife she was wrong. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his jaw tight with what looked like embarrassment. Not embarrassment for his wife's cruelty, but embarrassment for me. "Byron," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please." He finally looked up, but his eyes held no warmth, no recognition of the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for his future. "Maybe it would be better if you waited outside, Mom. This is really about the business assets and property transfers." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. My own son, the child I'd carried for 9 months, had nursed through midnight fevers, had cheered for at every little league game, was throwing me out like yesterday's garbage. Mr. Henderson looked appalled. "Now wait just a minute," Mrs. Holloway has every right to be here. As Blaine's widow, she's entitled to what? Ainsley snapped. She never worked a day in the family business. She never contributed anything except spending Blaine's money on her little hobbies. The real inheritance belongs to the people who actually built something. I stood on trembling legs, my whole body shaking with humiliation and rage. The room felt like it was spinning around me. 45 years of marriage reduced to nothing. A lifetime of love and partnership dismissed like I was some kind of gold digger. Fine, I managed to say, my voice stronger than I felt. I'll wait outside. As I walked toward the door, I heard Ainsley's satisfied laugh behind me. Good. Now we can have a real conversation about the family's future. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall. The secretary at the front desk looked at me with sympathy, but I couldn't bear her pity. I stumbled to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall, finally allowing the tears to come. What had I done wrong? How had I become such a stranger to my own son? I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The familiar streets of our neighborhood blurred past as tears continued to stream down my face. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the house Blaine and I had shared for over 3 decades, I sat in the car for several minutes, unable to face going inside. The silence in the house was deafening. Everything reminded me of Blaine, his reading glasses still on the kitchen counter, his coffee mug in the sink, the newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle he'd never finished. But now those memories were tainted by what had happened at the law office. Had he known? Had he secretly agreed with Ainsley that I didn't deserve to be part of his legacy? I made myself a cup of tea with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table where Blaine and I had shared thousands of meals together. The events of the morning played over and over in my mind like a terrible movie I couldn't turn off. Ainsley's cruel smile, Byron's refusal to look at me, the way they'd spoken about me like I was invisible. My thoughts drifted back to when Ainsley first came into our lives 5 years ago. Byron had been 32 then, successful in his own right as a marketing executive, but still searching for something. When he brought Ainsley home for the first time, I'd tried so hard to like her. She was beautiful, polished, and came from a wealthy family with connections in all the right places. But there had been signs from the beginning. The way she'd looked around our house during that first dinner, her eyes cataloging everything like she was taking inventory. How she'd ask pointed questions about Blaine's business, his investments, his plans for retirement. I'd mentioned my concerns to Blaine, but he'd brushed them off. "You're being paranoid, Maureen," he'd said, wrapping his arms around me as we cleaned up after one of Ainsley's visits. "She's just curious about the family she's marrying into. That's natural." I'd wanted to believe him. I'd wanted to believe that my unease was just typical mother-in-law jealousy. But the feeling in my gut never went away. The changes in Byron had been gradual at first. He'd started calling less frequently, claiming he was busy with work. When he did visit, Ainsley would dominate the conversation, steering it away from family memories toward discussions about their future plans. She'd speak about expensive vacations, designer renovations for their apartment, investment opportunities that required substantial capital. "Byron's so talented," she'd say, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "He just needs the right backing to really make something of himself. Family money can be so helpful in getting started." Blaine had been generous, of course. He'd given Byron a substantial loan to start his own consulting firm, had co-signed for their mortgage, had even paid for their lavish wedding. Each time I'd felt a knot of worry in my stomach, but Blaine insisted it was what fathers did for their sons. The real change came after they'd been married for 2 years. Byron stopped calling me directly, claiming Ainsley handled their social calendar. Holiday visits became stilted affairs where I felt like an outsider in my own home. Ainsley would bring up Blaine's age, his health, how important it was for him to think about succession planning. "You've worked so hard all these years," she'd tell him during one particularly uncomfortable Christmas dinner. "You deserve to relax and let the younger generation take over. Byron's ready to step up." I'd caught Blaine's eye across the table, seeing my own concern reflected there. But when I tried to talk to him about it later, he'd grown defensive. "She's not wrong, Maureen. I am getting older. Maybe it is time to think about passing more responsibility to Byron." The changes accelerated after that. Byron started coming to the office more frequently, inserting himself into business decisions. Ainsley would accompany him sometimes, charming Blaine's business partners and longtime associates. She had a way of making herself indispensable, remembering details about people's families, sending thoughtful gifts, positioning herself as the perfect daughter-in-law. But I saw through it. I watched her calculating gaze when she thought no one was looking. I noticed how she'd steer conversations toward money, toward inheritance, toward Blaine's estate planning. She was patient, methodical, playing a long game that none of us fully understood. The final blow came 6 months before Blaine's heart attack. Byron had suggested that his father should simplify his financial affairs, maybe consolidate some assets to make things easier when the time came. Ainsley had been full of helpful suggestions about tax strategies and estate planning, armed with research from expensive financial advisors. "We just want to make sure everything is set up properly," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. "So Maureen doesn't have to worry about complicated financial matters when she's grieving." Even then, she'd been planning to exclude me. Even then, she'd been positioning herself as the real heir to Blaine's legacy. I'd tried to warn Blaine, but he'd grown tired of what he saw as my unreasonable dislike of his daughter-in-law. We'd had our first real fight in decades about it. "She's family now, Maureen," he'd said, his voice filled with disappointment. "I need you to try harder to accept her." But accepting her would have meant accepting my own erasure from the family I'd helped build. And now, sitting alone in my kitchen, I realized that maybe I'd failed to do exactly that. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from Byron. "Mom, we need to talk. Ainsley thinks it would be best if we handled Dad's affairs without getting you too involved. It's just too stressful for someone your age." I stared at the message until the words blurred together. Someone my age. As if grief had expiration date. As if love could be measured in years instead of depth. I'd lost my husband, but somehow I'd lost my son long before that. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to enter Blaine's study. The room still smelled like his cologne, and the leather-bound books he loved so much. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, papers scattered across the surface. His favorite pen lying open beside an unfinished letter to our insurance company. I'd been avoiding this room, afraid of the memories it would bring back, but Byron's text message had lit a fire in me that I couldn't ignore. If they thought I was just some helpless old woman they could push aside, they were about to learn otherwise. I started with the obvious places first. Blaine had always been meticulous about his record-keeping, filing away important documents in labeled folders. But as I searched through his desk drawers and filing cabinets, I noticed something strange. Many of the files seemed incomplete, as if certain documents had been removed. The insurance papers were there, along with warranties for household items and correspondence with various service providers. But the financial documents, the investment records, the business partnerships, those files were either missing or contained only partial information. My heart began to race. Had someone already been through Blaine's papers? Had Byron and Ainsley taken what they wanted during those visits when they'd claimed to be helping Blaine organize his affairs? I was about to give up when I remembered something Blaine had told me years ago. He'd installed a safe in the basement during the renovation, hidden behind a false wall in his workshop. He'd mentioned it casually, joking that every man needed a place to hide his secret treasures from his wife. The basement workshop was Blaine's sanctuary, filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects. I'd rarely ventured down there, respecting his need for a space that was entirely his own. Now, searching behind his workbench, I found what looked like an ordinary panel of drywall, but when I pressed against it, it gave way slightly. My fingers found a hidden latch, and the panel swung open to reveal a large wall safe. The digital display blinked red, waiting for a password. I stared at it for several minutes, my mind racing through possibilities. Blaine had always been sentimental about certain dates and numbers. I tried our wedding anniversary first. Nothing. Byron's birthday. Nothing. Then, I remembered something. The coordinates of the spot where Blaine had proposed to me. A scenic overlook during our first trip together. He'd had them engraved inside my wedding ring as a surprise. The safe clicked open. Inside were dozens of folders, bank statements, investment records, and legal documents I'd never seen before. But what caught my attention immediately was a manila envelope with my name written across it in Blaine's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Maureen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I suspect things aren't going as smoothly as I'd hoped." I sank onto a dusty stool, my eyes devouring every word. "I've been watching Byron change over the past few years, and I've grown increasingly concerned about Ainsley's influence over him. I see the way she looks at our life, our assets, like she's already dividing everything up in her mind. I've seen her steering conversations toward inheritance and estate planning with a skill that would make a con artist proud." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Blaine's growing suspicions about Ainsley's motives and his disappointment in Byron's weakness. But more importantly, it outlined steps he'd taken to protect me. "I've transferred the majority of our liquid assets into accounts that only you can access," he wrote. "The lake house is already in your name, as are the rental properties downtown. What Byron and Ainsley think they're inheriting is only a fraction of what we actually built together." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the letter. There were account numbers, contact information for lawyers I'd never heard of, detailed instructions for accessing investments I didn't even know existed. "I'm sorry I had to do this in secret, my love. I didn't want you to worry, and I kept hoping Byron would come to his senses. But I couldn't risk our life's work falling into the wrong hands. You earned every penny of this through 45 years of love, sacrifice, and partnership. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." At the bottom of the letter was a business card for Margaret Chen Esken, with a handwritten note, "Call her immediately. She has instructions to help you." I sat in that dusty basement for another hour, going through the documents Blaine had hidden away. Bank statements showing accounts with my name as the sole beneficiary. Real estate deeds with my signature that I didn't remember signing. Investment portfolios worth millions that I'd never heard of. Blaine had been protecting me for years, quietly transferring assets and restructuring our finances while I went about my daily life, trusting him to handle the complicated business matters. He'd known this day would come, and he'd prepared for it. When I finally climbed the stairs back to the main floor, I felt different. The crushing weight of helplessness was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: power. I called Margaret Chen's office immediately. Her secretary put me through right away, as if she'd been expecting my call. "Mrs. Holloway?" Margaret's voice was warm but professional. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Blaine spoke of you often. Are you ready to discuss your situation?" "I think my family is trying to steal my inheritance," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Margaret laughed, but not unkindly. "From what Blaine told me, I think it's more accurate to say they're about to discover they never had any inheritance to steal." We scheduled a meeting for the next morning. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Blaine's death: hope. Byron sent another text that evening. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Ainsley's family has lawyers who specialize in estate matters. They're willing to help make sure you're taken care of." I stared at the message for a long time before typing my response. "Don't worry about me, son. I'm being taken care of better than you know." The next morning, I would learn exactly how well Blaine had taken care of me. And then Byron and Ainsley would discover that underestimating a grieving widow had been their biggest mistake. Margaret Chen's office was everything Blaine's old attorney's wasn't: modern, efficient, and filled with an energy that made me feel like I was finally in the right place. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet competence that reminded me of myself in my younger years. "Before we begin," Margaret said, settling behind her glass desk, "I want you to understand that your husband was one of the most meticulous men I've ever worked with. When he came to me 3 years ago, he had already identified the problem and was determined to solve it." She opened a thick folder with my name on it. "Blaine told me about the changes he'd observed in Byron and his concerns about Ainsley's influence. He was particularly worried about what would happen to you after his death." I leaned forward, still hardly believing what I was hearing. "He never said anything to me. He didn't want to worry you unless it became necessary. but he also didn't want to leave you vulnerable. Margaret pulled out a financial statement and slid it across the desk. This is what Blaine thought they were inheriting. The numbers on the page showed the family business, the main house, and various accounts totaling about $1.2 million. It was a substantial amount, but not the fortune I knew Blaine had accumulated over decades of careful investing and business deals. "And this," Margaret said, producing another document, "is what actually belongs to you." My eyes widened as I scanned the page. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Then I realized what I was looking at, and my breath caught in my throat. $8 million. "The lake house has been in your name for 5 years," Margaret continued calmly, as if she wasn't describing an amount of money that would change my entire life. "The downtown rental properties, the investment portfolio, the savings accounts, all legally yours." Blaine spent 3 years quietly restructuring everything. I stared at the papers, my mind reeling. "But how? I never signed anything." Margaret smiled. "Actually, you did. Remember those occasional trips to the bank when Blaine said he needed your signature for routine updates to your accounts? Or when he'd bring home papers for you to sign while you were watching television, claiming they were insurance renewals?" The memories came flooding back. Blaine occasionally asking me to sign documents while I was cooking dinner or reading a book. I'd trusted him completely, never bothering to read the fine print. I'd had no idea he was systematically transferring our wealth into my name. "The business itself," Margaret continued, "was restructured as well. Byron thinks he's inheriting a successful company. What he's actually inheriting is a shell corporation with significant debts and obligations. The profitable contracts, the valuable equipment, the real estate the business operates from, that all belongs to separate entities that you control." I felt dizzy trying to process it all. Why would Blaine do this without telling me? "Because he loved you," Margaret said simply, "and because he was hoping he wouldn't have to. Right up until the end, he believed Byron might come to his senses and treat you with the respect you deserved. This was his insurance policy." She pulled out another folder. "But there's more. Blaine was very specific about what should happen if certain conditions were met, and based on what happened at Henderson's office 3 days ago, I'd say those conditions have been fulfilled." My hands were trembling as I opened the new folder. Inside was a detailed plan that Blaine had crafted, complete with contingencies and instructions that showed just how well he'd known his son and daughter-in-law. "If Byron sides with Ainsley in excluding you from inheritance discussions," Margaret read from Blaine's notes, "then he's demonstrated that he's not capable of managing family assets responsibly. The trust provisions kick in immediately." The trust provisions were devastating. Byron would receive a modest monthly allowance for 5 years, enough to live comfortably, but not lavishly. After that, if he could demonstrate financial responsibility and had repaired his relationship with me, he might be eligible for more substantial support. Ainsley would receive nothing. "And if they contest any of this?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. Margaret's smile turned predatory. "Blaine anticipated that too. Any legal challenge to his arrangements will result in the immediate termination of Byron's allowance and a detailed investigation into their finances during his final years. Let's just say that some of the money Byron received for his business ventures didn't go where he claimed it did." I set the papers down, my head spinning. In the span of an hour, I'd gone from feeling like a powerless widow to discovering I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined. But more importantly, I wasn't helpless anymore. "When do they find out?" I asked. "That depends on you," Margaret replied. "Henderson will need to be informed about the real estate and business assets immediately. He's been working with incomplete information. But you get to decide when and how Byron and Ainsley learn the truth." I thought about it for several minutes, remembering Ainsley's cruel smile, Byron's refusal to defend me, the way they'd made me feel like a burden in my own family. "I want to be there when they find out," I said finally. "I want to see their faces when they realize what they've lost." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Blaine said you'd want that?" "He left specific instructions for how this should be handled. Would you like to hear them?" As Margaret outlined Blaine's plan for the revelation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. My husband had known me better than I'd known myself. He'd understood that I wouldn't want dramatic revenge, but I would want justice. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Henderson would call another family meeting. ostensibly to correct some oversights in the initial reading of the will. Byron and Ainsley would attend expecting to finalize their inheritance. Instead, they'd learned that they'd inherited almost nothing. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, handing me a sealed envelope. "Blaine wanted you to read this after you learned about the financial arrangements." Inside was another letter, shorter than the first, but no less powerful. "My darling Maureen," it read, "by now you know that I saw this coming. I'm sorry you had to endure their cruelty, but I needed you to see who they really were. You deserved better from our son, and I failed to give that to you while I was alive. But I can give you this, the power to choose your own family from now on. You owe them nothing. Live for yourself now, my love. You've earned it." As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. Byron and Ainsley thought they'd won by humiliating me, by pushing me out of my own family. They had no idea that their victory was about to become their downfall. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I had 3 days to prepare for the moment when my son would learn the price of betraying his mother. I arrived at Henderson's office 15 minutes early on Friday afternoon, my heart beating steadily in my chest. Margaret Chen walked beside me, her briefcase containing the documents that would change everything. I wore my best navy blue dress, the one Blaine had always said made my eyes look beautiful. Today, I wanted to look like the woman I truly was, not the helpless widow they'd dismissed. Byron and Ainsley were already seated at the conference table when we entered. Ainsley looked confident, almost bored, checking her manicured nails while Byron scrolled through his phone. They barely glanced up when I walked in. "Maureen," Henderson said, standing to greet me. His expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight nod he gave Margaret. "Thank you for coming." Ainsley finally looked up, her eyes narrowing when she saw Margaret. "Who's this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "This is Margaret Chen," I said calmly, taking my seat across from them. "My attorney." Byron's head snapped up from his phone. "Your attorney? Mom, what's going on?" "Mr. Henderson discovered some discrepancies in the estate documentation," Margaret said smoothly, settling into the chair beside me. "We're here to correct them." Ainsley's confidence flickered for just a moment. "What kind of discrepancies?" Henderson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "It appears that the initial reading was based on incomplete information. There are additional assets that weren't included in the original will." "Additional assets?" Byron leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with greed. "You mean there's more money?" I watched my son's face, seeing Ainsley's influence written in every greedy expression. When had he become this person? When had money become more important to him than love or loyalty? "In a manner of speaking," Margaret said, opening her briefcase. "But first, we need to address some irregularities in the existing documentation." She placed several folders on the table, each one labeled with different property addresses and account numbers. Ainsley's eyes darted between them, trying to read the labels upside down. "The lake house," Margaret began, "was transferred to Mrs. Holloway's name 5 years ago. It was never part of Blaine's estate." Byron frowned. "That can't be right. Dad always said the lake house would be mine someday." "He may have said that," Margaret replied evenly, "but legally it belongs to your mother." Ainsley sat up straighter, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "We'll need to see the documentation for that transfer." Margaret slid a folder across the table. "Of course." As Ainsley flipped through the papers, her face grew paler. The transfer was legitimate, properly notarized and filed with the county. There was no disputing it. "This must be a mistake," Byron said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Dad wouldn't have done this without telling us." "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice remaining professionally calm. "The downtown rental properties that generate approximately $40,000 per month in income? Also in Mrs. Holloway's name." Another folder slid across the table. Ainsley's hands were shaking now as she examined the deeds. The investment portfolio with Merrill Lynch, the savings accounts at First National, the bonds and CDs, all legally owned by Mrs. Holloway. With each revelation, I watched the color drain from Ainsley's face. Byron looked confused, like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "I don't understand," he said, his voice small. What does this mean? Margaret pulled out the final folder, the one that would destroy their dreams completely. It means that what you thought you were inheriting was only a small fraction of your father's actual wealth. The bulk of the estate, approximately $8 million, belongs to your mother. The silence in the room was deafening. Ainsley's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Byron stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. $8 million, Ainsley whispered. $8 million, Margaret confirmed. The business you thought you were inheriting? It comes with significant debts and obligations that will likely require immediate capital injection to remain viable. The equipment, the profitable contracts, the real estate it operates from, those are all owned by separate entities controlled by Mrs. Holloway. Byron finally found his voice. But that's impossible. Dad would have told me. We talked about succession planning, about my future role in the company. I spoke for the first time since the meeting began, my voice steady and clear. He did plan for your future, Byron. He planned for you to treat me with respect and kindness after his death. Instead, you chose to humiliate me and push me aside. Ainsley's shock was giving way to rage. This is fraud, she hissed. You manipulated a dying man into signing over his assets. Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Feel free to contest it in court, but I should warn you that any legal challenge will trigger certain provisions in the trust documents. Byron's monthly allowance would be immediately terminated, and we'd be required to conduct a full audit of all financial transactions during Blaine's final years. The threat hung in the air like a sword. Byron's face went white because he knew exactly what that audit would reveal. The business loans he'd never paid back, the credit cards Blaine had covered, the lavish lifestyle funded by his father's generosity. Monthly allowance? Byron asked weakly. Your father wasn't completely heartless, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. You'll receive $3,000 per month for the next 5 years. Enough to live comfortably while you figure out how to support yourself. $3,000? Ainsley shrieked. That's nothing. That won't even cover our mortgage. Then perhaps you should consider downsizing, Margaret suggested mildly. Ainsley turned her fury on me, her mask of civility finally slipping completely. You bitter old woman, you've destroyed this family out of spite. I looked at her for a long moment, feeling nothing but pity. I didn't destroy this family, Ainsley. You did. From the moment you decided I was an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be respected. Byron finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Mom, please, we can work this out. I know Ainsley was harsh, but she was just stressed about the estate issues. No, Byron, I said softly. She was showing me exactly who she is, and you were showing me exactly who you've become. I stood up, gathering my purse. The monthly payments will begin next week. If you can prove to me over the next 5 years that you remember how to be my son instead of her husband, we might revisit the arrangement. As I walked toward the door, Byron called after me desperately. Mom, wait! This isn't fair. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the son I'd raised with such love and hope. You're right, I said. It isn't fair. 45 years of marriage reduced to nothing. A lifetime of love dismissed like it never mattered. But that's not my fault, Byron. That's yours. Margaret and I left them sitting in stunned silence, their dreams of easy wealth crumbling around them. As we walked down the hallway, I heard Ainsley's voice rising in panic, already planning their next move, already scheming for ways to contest what they'd lost. But it was too late. Blaine had planned too well, and I was done being their victim. 6 months later, I sat on the deck of the lake house, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The peace I felt was something I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. No demands on my time, no guilt about not doing enough, no walking on eggshells around people who claimed to love me but treated me like a burden. The lake house had always been my favorite place, but Blaine and I had rarely spent time here during our later years. Byron and Ainsley had used it more than we did, treating it like their personal vacation home while we stayed behind to manage the responsibilities they created. Now it was truly mine, and I'd spent the past months making it feel like home. I'd hired a local woman, Rosa, who came twice a week to help with cleaning and had become a dear friend. Her grandmother had been Mexican, and she'd taught me to make tamales that reminded me of my own childhood in Texas. We'd sit on this same deck, preparing masa and sharing stories about our families. The transformation hadn't just been to the house. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying, the stress weight that had accumulated during years of family drama simply melting away. I'd started taking painting classes at the community center in town, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. My landscapes were amateur at best, but they captured the view from my deck, and that was enough. Margaret called me weekly, updating me on Byron and Ainsley's situation. They'd tried to contest the will, just as Blaine had predicted, but their lawyer had quickly advised them to drop it once he reviewed the documentation. The trust provisions were ironclad, and the threat of the financial audit had terrified Byron into compliance. They'd sold their expensive condo and moved into a modest apartment across town. Ainsley had been forced to take a job at a marketing firm, her first real employment in years. Byron was still struggling to make his business profitable without his father's hidden subsidies. "Have you heard from Byron?" Margaret had asked during our last conversation. "He calls sometimes," I'd admitted, "always when Ainsley isn't around." Those calls were awkward, stilted affairs where Byron would apologize without really understanding what he was apologizing for. He seemed to think that if he said the right words, I would restore his inheritance and everything would go back to the way it was. But I was done pretending that our relationship could return to something it had never really been. The real surprise had come 3 weeks ago when Rosa mentioned that a young man had been asking questions about me at the grocery store in town. "He said he was your nephew," she'd told me, her dark eyes concerned, but something about him didn't seem right. I'd known immediately it was Byron, probably sent by Ainsley to assess my lifestyle and look for weaknesses they could exploit. The thought that they were having me watched should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. They were still playing games while I was finally living my life. My phone rang now, interrupting my peaceful evening. Byron's name appeared on the screen, and for once, I felt ready to talk to him. "Hello, Byron. Mom." His voice sounded tired, older somehow. "How are you?" "I'm well. How are you and Ainsley adjusting to your new situation?" There was a long pause. "It's been hard. Ainsley's angry all the time. She blames me for not fighting harder for the inheritance." I said nothing, letting him fill the silence. "She wants me to hire a private investigator to look into Dad's financial dealings before he died. She thinks there might be grounds to challenge the trust based on undue influence or something." "And what do you think?" I asked, surprised by how little his words affected me. "I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing." Byron's voice cracked slightly. "I think he saw what I was becoming and tried to protect you from it. It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years." "I've been thinking about what you said that day at the lawyer's office," he continued, "about remembering how to be your son instead of her husband." "And? I don't know if I remember how. It's been so long since I thought about what you might want or need. Ainsley has opinions about everything, and it was easier to just go along with her than to think for myself." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar ache in my chest. This was the Byron I remembered. The little boy who used to come to me when he was confused or scared. But he was 40 years old now, and some lessons couldn't be unlearned overnight. "What do you want from me, Byron?" I asked gently. "I want to see you," he said. "Not to talk about money or inheritance or any of that. I just want to sit with my mother and remember who I used to be." The request surprised me. In all his calls over the past months, he'd never simply asked to spend time together. "Ainsley would have to stay home," I said finally. "I know. She wouldn't want to come anyway. She's pretty angry with both of us right now." I found myself smiling. "Both of us? She blames me for not being strong enough to control you. Apparently, I should have been able to manipulate you into giving us the money." The honesty in his voice gave me hope. Maybe there was still something salvageable in our relationship after all. "You can come for dinner Sunday," I said. "But Byron, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same woman I was 6 months ago. I'm not going to pretend to be grateful for scraps of attention from my own son. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be real." "I understand," he said quietly. "Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it. I know that doesn't fix anything. but I needed you to know. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness for a long time. Maybe Byron would remember how to be my son again. And maybe he wouldn't. Maybe his marriage to Ainsley would survive the loss of easy money. And maybe it wouldn't. But for the first time in years, those outcomes didn't depend on me. I wasn't responsible for fixing their problems or managing their emotions or sacrificing my own needs for their comfort. Blaine had given me more than financial security. He'd given me permission to live for myself, to choose my own family from the people who truly valued me. Rosa had invited me to her daughter's quinceañera next month. The painting instructor had asked if I'd be interested in helping with the beginners class. There were possibilities ahead of me that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or widow. I went inside and poured myself a glass of wine, then returned to the deck to watch the stars emerge over the lake. Tomorrow I would start planning the menu for Sunday's dinner with Byron. But tonight, I was simply a woman at peace, finally free to discover who she was when nobody needed anything from her. The lake whispered against the shore, and for the first time in decades, I whispered back. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.